basically the government taking that information and creating their own. The technology that Standeo was working on with anti-gravity craft, I think it follows along the same thing. You can go back to the Nazis with the Die Glocke and different things like that they made, which also they were highly involved with the occult. They didn't just wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to try this, this, and this. There was a basis. They went in there and they performed rituals to get the information to be able to practice that.
When you talk to someone who has worked in a deep underground military base, which we've interviewed people, they talk about different classes of entities. None of that is really mentioned in 6751. It's more so an overall summarization of what's going on. Now, there were some information about traveling dimensions. There's some very fascinating tidbits in this document. And we don't really go too deep into the document other than referencing it in the film, because we had to go through, we've got over 300 declassified documents in our collection right now, all extrasensory perception, psychic activity that they're training people to operate in. The federal government has been training people in the occult since the 40s. Training them in how to operate in occult magic and occult sciences. Everything our Bible tells us is absolutely forbidden. Our federal government has been a part of this since the 40s. And I want to add, back in the 40s, they still promoted the idea of a Christian nation of America. Yet behind the scenes, it just goes to show that the people in charge of our government have been pacifying the society since the beginning. And I don't understand how people could be so blinded. We present the information. This is what they said in the 40s, and it's only gotten worse over the years. Now, let me just draw us into this other area real fast. This group, the Collins Elite, they really wanted to create some type of resistance. Non-aggressive, of course. Non-aggressive resistance. That's what I understand that from my studies. That's what I believe. They wanted a non-aggressive resistance to what was taking place, because they saw that when a man or a group of men began to communicate with these entities, the hunger for power gets greater and greater and greater, and then you're no longer trying to get answers. You're now wanting to ask them to give you blessings. You're now getting technology and information from these entities, and you're utilizing it in the way that you structure your government moving forward. And you would say, well, why would these entities need the government? It's not a matter of them needing the government. It's a matter of setting up the scene for the end times deception, where the Antichrist is going to unite the governments of the world. It's all part of their long game. They've been working on this since the beginning of time. It didn't work at the Tower of Babel. The Lord ended it quickly, but here we are today. Where are we today, and what happened between then and now? Well, what we find out is that one of our contacts, Standeo, who, by the way, Tom Horn gave us a great endorsement of Standeo years ago. He had this big newspaper article from the UK, and standing on the cover with these other elite doctors and scientists, it's Standeo, and they're giving him credit in the UK, public knowledge that he's working on anti-gravity craft. Now, the film that we did called The Hollow Earth Chronicles, we did a whole segment in that film on Operation High Jump. This was a joint task force between the American government, the British government, and the Australian government, headed by the U.S. and Admiral Byrd. They go down to Antarctica, and their big plan got cut in half, and they had to come home early because the same three governments that are now working together with Standeo, the British, the American, and the Australians, working together years after Operation High Jump happened. Standeo was working as a secret agent for the FBI in Australia, inside of the deep underground military bases. And he said while he was in the program, he knew about the deal with Eisenhower. He knew in the program that President Eisenhower had made a deal with what they called entities. I believe that the evidence points to two events taking place, and these two events happened 1 year apart. The first one happened at Edwards Air Force Base, where Eisenhower disappears, and they call it a media blackout. It was kind of similar to when Hillary Clinton and President Obama disappeared and were at the Bilderberg meeting, but nobody knew where they were, and it was called the media blackout. People freaked out, right? Well, something similar happened here, where Eisenhower is no longer on radar, and they come back later and say, oh, well, he had a dental emergency. Now, that happened, and then a year later, we have the Holloman Air Force Base event. Now, the thing about the Holloman event was that people were there who witnessed it. Holloman is where they were out on the landing strip, and you had UFOs landing, meeting with him. Meeting took place with Eisenhower and others, and then those UFOs took off. Now, there were eyewitnesses who have come forward. I was just talking about this with Chad Riley because he found some videotapes from the 90s. This is before the internet was doing its thing. In the 90s, there were videos that were recorded, old VHS tapes of some of these disclosure type engagements. I don't know what you want to call it, but these are men that were there. They're decorated men from the government, and they're now speaking out that yes, UFOs were landing and taking off at Holloman Air Force Base, and I believe it was 1955. We do know that things began to be more apparent after Babylon working, and therefore there were more things taking place where there was people seeking the entity. So what I believe happened was that the rift was open, the tear in the space-time continuum, if you will, a portal, Stargate was opened, and the government got involved. The feds got involved. Once they began to communicate with the entities, there was now a relationship being built, and it was no longer shock value that there are these entities who want to work with us. So I think that was definitely an open door, no pun intended, for those entities to now be communicating with President Eisenhower years later. Not too many years later, but a few years later. They're now meeting with Eisenhower. And so the story goes like this. We're on the road trip. We're driving out to meet with Ray Boucher, who was contacted by the Department of Defense. This is really important. This is one of those like haymakers. The information that he gives us that he presented his full disclosure in our film Higher Entities. But we're driving there and we're having a discussion, and we decided let's just go ahead and let's run some cameras, while we're driving and talking. So we set up our production stuff in Darren's SUV. We're driving down the road, and we have this conversation about this Eisenhower deal. See, what I had heard and researched was a little different than what Darren had picked up in his research. And this is one of those scenes in the movie where it's just like, wow, like the stuff that came out was so organic and unbelievable. Apparently, there were two events that happened, and a lot of people blur them. A lot of people will mix it up with the Edwards Air Force Base and the Holloman. They're two separate events a year apart. That's so important. But the idea is that the gray aliens, on record, met with Eisenhower. And then you had this other group of entities known as like the Tall Whites or the Nordics. They met with Eisenhower separately, and they warned him. They said, you do not ever want to make a deal with the gray aliens. They are deceptive. They are very deceptive. All they want to do is deceive you and enslave you. They're demonic, basically. I don't think they use the word demonic, right? Because they're all demonic. But they were warning Eisenhower never to enter into a covenant with the Greys. Well, they were the good guys, the Greys were the bad guys. This is fascinating because if you fast forward into this idea of a coming deception, they had to already set the groundwork to create a good alien, bad alien, good cop, bad cop. Because what we're dealing with here is a bunch of liars. Satan's a liar, his demons are liars. That's why when someone starts playing with a Ouija board, their grandmother starts talking to them. Well, it's not your grandmother, bro. Yeah. That's a demon. Yeah. That's an entity who wants to deceive you. Sure. They want to steal, to kill, and to destroy. That's biblical. And we're also told as Christians, we got to be vigilant and we got to be sober-minded because Satan is our adversary. And the word Satan, the name Satan isn't really a name. We have this misconception that Satan, the devil, the red pitchfork, and in reality, Ha-Satan is the enemy, the adversary. And so when we say Satan, it could actually be referring to the whole team of demons and entities, fallen angels. And so what we have the fallen angels, and now it's my personal belief. Let me just, based on the book of Revelation and understanding some definitions, I was able to calculate that if a third of the angels fell with Lucifer, with Satan, if a the Satan, right? If a third of them fell with him, and that's also based on another passage of a third of the stars getting knocked down to earth. If that passage means what we think it means, and if we understand it, it's also based on another passage of a third of the stars getting knocked down to earth. If that passage means what we think it means, and if we understand it correctly, a third of the angels fell with Satan. And you can do your math and figure out that that equals somewhere between 30 to 50 plus million fallen angels on the surface of the earth. Now, out of that, some of them were put in chains. The Bible tells us this because the ones that committed sexual sin, the Genesis 6, they have been locked up in chains. We can read about this in Jude. But the ones that are not locked in chains, just think about it, 30 to 50 plus million fallen angels on the face of the earth. Like that's I made the comment recently in an interview I did that is more than the population of the largest state in America.
I mean, these are the gods of the nations. These are the ones who have been worshipped throughout time. These are the ones of the nations who they set up the groves and the high places and offered sacrifices to them. They've been presenting themselves to humanity throughout time under different names, but under the same descriptions of their characteristics. Wow. So when you look at it in those kind of terms, and to also answer your question about are they otherworldly or interdimensional, through the document 6751, we did find that back in the 40s even, they were saying that they were interdimensional beings. Wow. So that will parallel with what Scripture has to say of fallen angels. With Job, for instance, you have Job, and this kind of is a crossover between our first film, Hollow Earth Chronicles, and the latest Higher Entities. But in Job, you have, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. So on one hand, you have him being able to present himself before the Lord, but he also is able to, and that's the spiritual realm. That's the things that we can't access. There's a barrier that's been put in place. But Satan and these divine beings, with the divine council, they were able to hold an audience before the Lord. At the same time, Satan says here that he's allowed, or that he's been going to and fro in the earth and walking up and down in it. So that's
one day he comes out and says, well, this is crazy because we're actually working with this type of stuff at Los Alamos. Now, he gives her information that we don't know, but he disclosed to her what he was doing in the alien base, that the conspiracy theorists call an alien base. But now it doesn't really seem like a conspiracy theory anymore, because if it was just a theory, why would he have been killed 24 hours later? 24 hours after he shares what they were doing at Los Alamos, he disappears. No body found, nothing. They say that they've never seen him back in the offices, So she reaches out and she's like, where's my husband never came home from work. He left for work. He left our house. He drove, he went to Los Alamos, but he never came home. Well, she now wants to get her benefits just to help pay for all the expenses that he was bringing in money. He's no longer there, and he's been working hard. There's pension and guarantees that she's supposed to get. They won't give her anything because there's no body. Without a body, there's no death certificate. Without a death certificate, there's no benefits. So she, working for the federal government as well, she starts rattling the cage high up, and finally, once she starts dropping information that's putting fear in people, they, in order to shut her up, finally say, okay, you know what, here you go, here's your benefits, done. Now, that tells me that it's not a conspiracy theory, that there's actual fact to this. There's demonic activity going on at Los Alamos, and it was so serious that they would have had his house bugged. Wow. And that they were tracking every discussion he had in that house. And that was the thing, was he was working in the DUM, the Deep Underground Military Base. From my understanding, he was working there, and he told her what he was working on. Wow. We don't even know what that was. That's what's so fascinating about this story, is that we don't even know what he disclosed, but it was something so serious that 24 hours later, he's dead. Again, we're dealing with the fallout of what took place at the Babylon Working. Babylon Working changed everything. I believe that was prophetic on the satanic timeline. That was a big deal. And so I do believe for a fact that Roswell was just another byproduct. And I also believe, based on another FBI document that we have in our stack, of over 300 is that there were